So we're here to talk about the crucial role of vaccines in global public health, and I'm here with three people who approach that from all different angles, so we're going to get a kind of a 360 view of that. So I'd like to just kick things off with sort of how far we've come and sort of get a sense of what have the successes been so far. So kind of from each of your vantage points, what have we accomplished with vaccines? What does the world not have to worry about anymore thanks to this amazing innovation?
Well, let me start. And I think part of this is the way, and I think you've gotten a feel for this from the earlier panels, that there's a vaccination world and a vaccine world and a vaccination world, and there's not necessarily a line that connects them. So maybe I'll talk about the vaccination part of it, because at the Sabin Vaccine Institute, we're focused largely on improving access to vaccines and how we can help strengthen systems to do that, and some of the knowledge and innovation to get there. So at the vaccination end, I mean, what hopefully everybody knows is that you don't have to worry about smallpox. That has been a disease that's been eradicated, and we can talk some more about polio, which is on the cusp of that. But overall, getting vaccines to the people who need them most has made huge differences globally. In the United States, it's also made such a difference that people growing up now don't know any of these diseases they're being vaccinated about. So the strengthening systems that get vaccines to the people has had a huge impact. And maybe you want to talk about the science and the vaccine part of it, because those are hand in hand. You can't have vaccination without vaccine, and just having vaccine doesn't mean it's going to get to where it needs to go.
And absolutely, and you know, when you think about just vaccines, as Mr. Gates says, he says they're like magic, and they really are. I mean, we eradicated smallpox from the face of the earth using vaccines. With polio, we have had only 13 cases this year, so fewer cases than ever before in 2 countries. That's down from 355,000 cases in 125 countries in 1988. So look where we are, and next year will probably be the last year that we'll see wild-type polio on the face of the earth, and that's because of oral polio vaccine. It's just been amazing. Measles deaths are down by 75%, which is just phenomenal. But unfortunately, there's still 1 in 5 children globally that aren't getting the vaccines that they need. There's still 1.5 million deaths every year from vaccine-preventable diseases, and that's what we have to fix. It's the vaccination problem is why those 1.5 million deaths are still occurring. So we need to make sure that there's good delivery systems and strong infrastructure so that the vaccines that are being developed by the wonderful scientists he's going to talk about are actually reaching the people who need them.
So, you know, from our perspective, we say that vaccines beyond clean water are probably the most important health intervention. We've had tens of millions of lives have been saved. Many of us are here because we've been vaccinated or someone before us has been vaccinated. When we look forward to the future, we think that we can do even more, that this was just the start. And so vaccines against HIV and malaria, I think, are possible, tuberculosis. If we look into the non-communicable diseases and we start to understand how the immune system works, we're start to able to unravel it and figure out how the immune system fights disease, we start to look at things like cancer, perhaps even regulating autoimmunity or other areas. We look at pandemics like influenza or Ebola. If we had effective vaccines for that, we think that these successes were just the start, and over the next 50 years, we could have broad advances across many different areas of health.
And what is the role of the U.S. in kind of securing vaccines globally, or vaccination from either side?
So in my past role at the Department of Health and Human Services, at the National Vaccine Program Office, I had a window into that. And I think there are 2 parts to that answer. One part is the U.S. role in supporting global immunization broadly, and participating in countries doing that, also participating with Gavi, the Global Alliance. And the other is on a technical basis. From a Department of Health and Human Service perspective, every agency within that has a strong global health component. So it's the CDC, you see them as the disease fighters when there's an outbreak. But what you don't see so much is the FDA helping countries develop their own regulatory authorities, the NIH doing research in the field. So virtually all the parts of what I was familiar with at the Department of Health and Human Services had this technical input, which is separate from a financial support of a system like Gavi.
Right. And so what about SPAPIY? I mean, we have this new innovation for securing vaccines globally called SPAPIY. How did that come about, and what is that aiming to do or doing already?
Yeah. So SPAPIY, for those of you who don't know, is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and it really came out of the Ebola crisis that we had. As we know, there were a lot of lessons that we learned from the Ebola crisis. One is the importance of the infrastructure, making sure you've got good systems to detect disease early and to prevent it. You've got good immunization systems, which add to that infrastructure. So we recognized that, but we also recognized that if you don't have that good infrastructure, then you need vaccines. You need vaccines stockpiled. You need rapid response platforms to control those outbreaks and to prevent them from becoming humanitarian crises. So SPAPIY was formed to actually provide the vaccine response to outbreaks. And so they are working on diseases that have a high probability of causing outbreaks and that could cause global crises in the future. They're funding partners around the world to make vaccines against those diseases. The idea is those vaccines would be stockpiled so they would be ready for use if an outbreak occurs. They're also working on what we call rapid response platforms. So they are funding innovators in the US and elsewhere to develop technologies like nucleic acid vaccines, RNA, DNA vaccines, that when an unknown pathogen emerges, you can use these technologies to rapidly make a vaccine that's genetically matched to that new pathogen and get it distributed, and with the first vaccine being available in just a few weeks. You know, are we where we need to be? No, but are we making a lot of progress? Yes, and SPAPIY is just one piece of that puzzle that's going on around the world.
Let me just add to that, because of what SPAPIY is not. And I think it's important because SPAPIY is not, you just heard about HIV, SPAPIY is not TB, and SPAPIY is not influenza, because when they scan that space, there were other places working for that. So I think it's important when you start looking at SPAPIY as the disease they're going after, that because they're not including those three doesn't mean they're not important. I mean, and Ted and I were just talking about influenza. We have an influenza vaccine that needs to be better, and we need to have a vaccine that's going to be broader protective. So there's a science component to that. But the point is that SPAPIY has carved out a niche of trying to identify those diseases that could take off and be more ready from a vaccine standpoint. But there are other diseases that aren't on the SPAPIY list which are equally or more important.
So how would something like that change the trajectory of like the Ebola outbreak that we just saw in 2014?
So when you look at the epidemic curves and the cases and the number of deaths that we're accumulating, we've done a lot of modeling to look at, well, what would have happened if we had a vaccine available, at the 6-month point, the 5-month point, the 4-month point, the 3-month point. And it's phenomenal how many lives could have been saved. If you translate that to say, what if we had a flu pandemic, like the 1918 flu? When we did modeling to look at that, I mean, literally every week saves thousands and thousands of lives. So these rapid response platforms are really important. One of the reasons, though, why the foundation is supporting SPAPIY, the Gates Foundation is supporting SPAPIY, another reason, is because these same rapid response platforms can be utilized for vaccines against diseases of the poorest and diseases that we haven't conquered yet, like HIV, like malaria, like TB. So that will be what we're hoping is a spillover effect, if you will. While they're working on these niche diseases, the learnings from that are going to then be able to be applied to these other diseases of the poorest.
And speaking of the flu, Ted, do you want to tell us a little bit about the influenza project and kind of why a new or new types of flu vaccines are important?
Sure. So I work at the Human Vaccines Project. Last week, we launched something called the Universal Influenza Vaccine Initiative. And when we talked to scientists across the field and we looked at the field, there's a concern that the current flu vaccines aren't as good as they should be. We have to get vaccinated every year. They don't work in everyone. They particularly don't work in the people who are most vulnerable, the elderly and the young, people in the developing world. And the vaccines often don't cover pandemic strains. And as Penny was saying, every 25 years or so we have these outbreaks, these pandemic outbreaks. And should we have something on the scale of 1918, which killed 50 to 100 million people in a time we didn't have jet planes, in a time we didn't have mass migration, it could be really, really devastating to global health. And so the need for a vaccine is clear there. And one of the main things that we focus on is understanding how to generate human immune responses effectively for all people across all strains. This is a tall scientific order, but we do know that some people are protected, and we do know that the immune system does have strong immune responses against influenza, and the trick is getting that to be broader and broader across populations, across flu strains.
Could you clarify, because I think a lot of people here, they maybe went to CVS and got a flu shot, so how is this different?
So the flu is an incredibly varied virus, and we have to predict every year which one comes out, but we only hit a certain number of strains that have circulated or that may be circulating in a particular year. We want to expand it so that anything that's under that rubric of what is flu we can protect for. And that's seasonal strains and pandemic strains.
Oh, wow.
I think the subtext, though, and you heard this in the earlier panels, is that the, quote, easy vaccines have been made. The hard ones are where you have to do better than Mother Nature. You have to do better than natural immunity. That's clearly the case with some of these iconic diseases, HIV, TB, malaria, and flu, because we need to understand how to do that. So it's not just matching the strains, but can't we get longer protection than a year? We know that many vaccines we have can give you, like measles, can give you a lifelong protection. Understanding why that is, or understanding why it is that some people don't get that, is critical science, the kind of stuff that the upstream immunology community is working on, and building on the huge amount of investments in that science. I think there's going to have payoffs that we really can't even guess how they're going to play out.
So I want to dig in a little bit into what that work looks like on a day-to-day basis. Can you guys talk about kind of your, a couple of the diseases that you worked on, maybe typhoid in your case, and malaria and TB in yours?
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me start with typhoid. So there are a number of global immunization programs at the Sabin Vaccine Institute that we house something called the Coalition Against Typhoid. And it's really all the players who have some stake in that, including the science community, the vaccine delivery community, and the water and sanitation community as well. I think that why typhoid is so important is that it's the iconic disease of the poor. If you have water and sanitation, you don't have typhoid. And you can watch societies that have that infrastructure development and typhoid goes away. So now, and particularly from Mr. Gates' perspective of looking at the disease of the poor who shouldn't necessarily suffer from that, on top of that, we have the problem of antibiotic resistance. And over the past 15 years, the typhoid strains are becoming increasingly resistant to antibiotics, and now you have this worst case scenario of the iconic disease of the poor that's creeping towards being untreatable. There's a new vaccine that was just discussed at the World Health Organization a few weeks ago that I think is going to make some huge inroads into that. But again, that's one of many Sabin programs is trying to think about how we raise awareness and improve access to a vaccine like the typhoid vaccine.
And at the Bill and Melinda Gates Medical Research Institute, we're focused on malaria, tuberculosis, and enteric diseases. And you can kind of think of it, it's new, it's still in its infancy, but you can think of it as a nonprofit biotech. And we believe that all lives have equal value and that everyone deserves the right to have a healthy and productive life. And so the concept, this new institute, is that we will take the latest technology, the learnings from the HIV field, the learnings from the immuno-oncology field, the learnings from the orphan diseases and gene therapy fields, and we will take and apply all of that knowledge to these diseases of the poorest and try to find solutions for malaria, for TB, and for other enteric diseases beyond rotavirus. These diseases together are killing 4 people every minute. It's crazy. It's just mind-boggling. And so to be able to have the opportunity to actually apply the latest technologies to these diseases and to move forward with finding solutions, new vaccines, et cetera, to reach our goals are really important. And it's an incredible opportunity. We're getting started on it, still in its infancy, but we're really excited about the potential for reaching our goals, eradicating malaria, ending diarrheal disease deaths, and bending that TB epidemic curve.
So I want to talk a little bit about the vaccination component and actually, getting those vaccines into people who need them. Bruce, maybe you want to tell us a little bit about herd immunity, how it works, and why it's so important, and where that might be in jeopardy today.
So again, the concept, and I think that when you think about community immunity, that's what it's about, and how vaccines really facilitate that. What's unique about vaccines is that they prevent disease in individuals and in communities at large. And actually, that's important because no vaccine is 100%. So even if you've been vaccinated, you still may be susceptible. But the reason you don't get these diseases is because the population at large has been immunized. If you're a virus and everybody in the community has been immunized, you have a hard time finding a place to go. So that's really what the concept is about. I think, and you're gonna hear about measles soon, but measles is probably the indicator disease. It is the most infectious disease that we know.
Wow.
If in a susceptible population, up to 18 people will be infected by one person with measles. So look at how that will explode. And so maybe the upside of the story of these small outbreaks is how much of the population is immune so that these sparks don't become forest fires.
Wow.
Just to add and give a really concrete example of herd immunity, I worked on rotavirus vaccines at the beginning of my career, and there's a report that came out a couple of years ago that said the herd immunity with rotavirus is beyond what we ever expected. So, rotavirus vaccine is given to little kids at age 2, 4, 6 months. The protection from that vaccine goes all the way to age 44 years. The CDC has shown that there's a reduction in hospitalization for diarrheal diseases, not just in the year-old kids or the toddlers, but all the way up through age 44. So with that herd immunity effect, you're actually protecting the parents of the children and their siblings.
People who haven't been vaccinated.
Yes, yeah. People who haven't been vaccinated. Yeah, and so that's just one example of the amazing impact of herd immunity.
And then there are people in the community who can't be, who have a medical contraindication. They may have an immune system issue, being treated for cancer, and those people can't be vaccinated for some vaccines. So the more people around them who are vaccinated, the less likely they're going to be found by that virus.
Right. And and it's interesting because at the same time we're at this moment nationally where in some communities, people are kind of turning inward. So something I hear when I'm out reporting is that, well, we can support global health after we've fixed all of our problems here in America. We have our own health problems and we have homelessness and whatnot. Can you guys talk about how national security and how America's public health is connected to global public health and why it's important to prevent these diseases at the site where they happen?
Well, let me just take one step back because a little over 10 years ago, the World Health Organization issued something called the International Health Regulations. And it was really the recognition that diseases anywhere could be diseases everywhere, and the importance of surveillance, the importance of reporting, so that you could try to get ahead of things before they took off. Now, my analogy before was a spark in a forest fire. You want to go after things when they're sparks and not when they're raging. So that has now been in place for 10 years. I think all the countries in the world have signed up for that. There are now evaluations of various programs. People externally come in and evaluate programs. We had that in the United States to see where there are still things that need to be improved. So I think the point is that this is something that all countries are looking at, and an issue anywhere could be an issue everywhere. So an outbreak anywhere, and that's why we're so worried about Ebola, could rapidly be that outbreak everywhere. So I think the interlocking between national security here, national security elsewhere, and global health security is one puzzle.
And just, if you bring it back to influenza back in 1918, we didn't have much international trade, we didn't have airplanes. Within less than a year, 30% of the global population was infected. If we had a similar virus like that today, it would be catastrophic, not just from a health perspective, from an economic perspective, a social perspective, and a security perspective. We're interconnected. These diseases don't respect boundaries, and they move very fast, and we can't control that. So we need to respond with science measures and health measures and structural measures against these things.
I was wondering if you guys have any kind of learnings from the field or from times that you visited the countries that are affected by some of these diseases, especially poorer countries. What is everyday life like when something like malaria or TB is a constant threat for you?
Yeah. So in my work with the Centers for Disease Control and then at the Gates Foundation, I'm often in low-income countries. And, I've seen those diseases that we don't see any longer here. I've seen neonatal tetanus, I've seen Hib meningitis, I've seen, deaths from measles, et cetera. And one experience that I had in particular, I remember I was at CDC doing a study looking at diarrheal disease in infants born to HIV-infected mothers. And I would go on hospital rounds with the local pediatrician every morning. And so I went into a room. We went into a room. Now this hospital, you know, it's concrete block. This particular part of the hospital had no electricity. There was a window with the sun coming through, and then, you know, a crib with a little girl in the crib lined up along the wall. She was about 3 years old. And I went in, and she was very, very ill. All my pediatric instincts immediately kicked in. Her respiratory rate was 90, and that normally a child of that age would have a respiratory rate of about 20. And so I was like, we've got to take her to the intensive care unit. We've got to get her on a ventilator, but of course none of that was available. And as I stood there in that room for the next 10 minutes, that child's respiratory rate dropped to 60 and to 40 and to 20 and then to nothing. And she died right then and there. And the pediatrician, the local pediatrician, was actually talking to the mother and saying, you know, looking at her and saying, and almost yelling at her, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And then I realized this child had the rash of measles. She had measles pneumonitis, and that's why she died. And the pediatrician was asking the mother why she didn't get the child vaccinated. Well, the mother, in fact, when that child was 1 year of age, had walked 12 miles to get her child's vaccine for measles. And when she got to the clinic, there was no vaccine because robbers had broken into the clinic and stolen all of it. It gets back to that vaccination point. There's so many steps along the way that are problematic. So these are the, you know, these are the things that you know, people in low-income countries are going through. And we just, you know, we forget here in the U.S. how good we have it because vaccines have been so successful, we don't see these diseases anymore. But in fact, you know, mothers in low-income countries will walk for miles and miles to have their children vaccinated.
Wow. Well, in a second, I'm going to take questions from the audience, but can you kind of, you know, highlight some of the things that could help, you know, prevent things like that from happening in the future? Like what could, in the future, what could help children like that actually survive?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's several things, and actually this is something that the Sabin Institute works on, really thinking about, okay, first of all, we have to make sure vaccines are available at an affordable price and in the right profile, the right characteristics so that they're easy to give in low-income countries. So that's something we really think about, and at the Gates Foundation and at the Institute, it's what are the characteristics of that vaccine that we should be thinking about when we're first developing it so that it can be easier to deliver down the road. So that's one really important piece, you know, how can we make it more affordable? How can we make it easier to give? And then the other pieces of it really gets to the vaccination delivery system and how can we improve those? And Bruce, you may want to comment further on that so that we can prevent these diseases.
Well, and in fact, it gets, so that's right, because it's the ability to manage a program and to make sure that the vaccine gets to where it needs to go and all the pieces about that the refrigeration equipment is working and in place so the vaccine doesn't fall out of that system over time. And it gets down to that clinic and that the people, there's an appreciation by the people providing the vaccine of what these people have gone through to get there. There is, I think, equally the part about making sure that not only the programs are stable, but it actually gets back to this, the concern about the response in a pandemic. It's these everyday systems that we're going to call on when there's a big problem. And if these systems aren't working now, when SPAPIY delivers some great vaccine, unless there's a system to deliver it, it's going to sit at a loading dock.
Wow. Have there been any technological innovations that have made any of this easier? I mean, we've seen so much in just the last few years with drones and all sorts of other things being deployed to developing countries. Has any of that helped with this?
Yeah, I think it's still early days yet. Yeah. Certainly looking at drones to deliver medical supplies is something that is being done and that we're very interested in. We're also looking at new delivery devices. Yeah. So for example, for measles, we're really focused on trying to develop a measles patch. Okay. So it'd be like a little patch with microneedles that you could put on the child's arm or on their back, and the needles just dissolve in like 2 to 3 minutes. And so, I mean, those are hard to manufacture, they're hard to stabilize, but we're doing more and more work and things in that area. So looking at, another thing we're looking at is, you know, vaccine where you would give a single shot, but it would be slowly released over time so the children wouldn't have to come back to the clinic for their subsequent boosters. So there's a lot of that work going on. You know, I still think we're 10 to 15 years away from it, but I think we will get there.
Yeah, definitely a little easier to give a patch to a little baby, right, than a shot. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, do you guys have any questions? Questions? No questions.
We can see the bubbles of your head, so you know what the questions are.
Okay, well, why don't we talk a little more? What are some of the kind of the scientific challenges that are, you know, we've talked a little bit about delivery and some of the kind of hurdles along the way, robbers, for example. But when you look at the science, like, why is it so difficult to make new vaccines?
So, you know, I think, as Bruce was saying before, many of the quote-unquote easy vaccines have done. These are against viruses or pathogens that are not that complicated genetically. And things like HIV or tuberculosis are really complex organisms. And what we're doing now, and many scientists are doing now, is focusing on the system that prevents and fights disease, which is the immune system, instead of the virus. And we're trying to figure out, there must be some rules and some common way the body works to fight disease. And if those can be unraveled, and we now have the technologies in genomics and bioinformatics to do that, we can figure out the blueprint or the key to how the body fights disease and use that to make better vaccines against these really, really complicated targets.
So is it personalized then, or is it kind of?
Some of it could be personalized, but in vaccination, you're mostly interested in generalized. You want to protect as many people as possible across a broad swath of geography as you can. And so you really want to get down to the core rules of how the immune system fights disease, the core rules of immunity, basically, and figure out what those are to be able to engineer the vaccines in the future against the really, really, really difficult targets.
And on the personalized part, it's trying to understand what is it about that subset of people who don't have an immune response to a vaccine versus those who do. So there's little insights into that now, but trying to tease that out, I think, is going to go a long way to understanding immune protection more broadly.
Yeah, and part of what we've been doing at the Foundation is really looking, say, people with malaria, for example, looking at their antibody response and actually building the phylogenetic tree, understanding at a molecular level what that response is, and then we can take that knowledge and use that to create a vaccine. We call it reverse engineer the vaccine, and then move forward with that. So that's part of what we'll be doing at the Institute as well.
Oh, wow. Oh, we have a question.
Oh, you have told it. Okay. So, you know, some of the easy vaccines, polio, smallpox, have been very successful because there is no other animal reservoir of it. So you vaccinate the human population and that's it. You've eliminated it. So how can we address the zoonotic reservoirs of infectious disease from which these emerging infectious diseases come? And is there a sort of One Health approach that can be utilised for that?
I think that's a great question, and I think the answer is to have a multi-pronged strategy. It really is the One Health approach. You know, of course, my background and what I'm working on is malaria. Well, if you think about our goal at the Foundation is to eradicate malaria, just like we're eradicating smallpox, or just like we've eradicated smallpox and the world is, and the Global Polio Eradication Initiative has eradicated polio, or is about to eradicate polio. So the issue is that you have to have a multi-pronged approach where you're trying to control the vector, the mosquito, as well as prevent disease and transmission from the human. So it involves, you know, insecticides, insecticide-treated bed nets, potentially genetically modified mosquitoes, Wolbachia-infected mosquitoes. You've got drugs and vaccines. So I think it's going to take the entire armamentarium to actually eradicate malaria. If you look at other zoonotic diseases that cause outbreaks, you know, the hemorrhagic fever viruses, et cetera, I think in those cases, it goes back to what, you know, we've been talking about. We have to have strong infrastructure to detect the outbreaks early and to contain them. And there are some low-income countries who do this amazingly well. I mean, look at Ghana. They've done an amazing job with controlling these types of outbreaks. So I think it's a mix of both, and we just can't take a single approach, but we have to take a holistic approach to these types of things.
Yeah, and it's, you know, it's disease. I think the concept is really the right one, and you have to look at it disease by disease because it plays out differently. And then one place that is getting a lot of attention, and I think increasingly the vaccines, or a piece of that is antibiotic resistance, where there's clearly the relationship between the way that humans use antibiotics and the way that animals are being fed antibiotics. So that's another one where a global health, One Health approach is going to matter. But it's also a great place for vaccines. If you're going to prevent these diseases, then you don't have to even think about treating them. As an adjunct to antibiotic stewardship, is that the more that people are protected from these diseases, the less antibiotics we have to use. We brought up the situation of typhoid. We'll see how this plays out. There's now this new typhoid vaccine that is recommended for parts of the world that have a high typhoid burden and also have a high burden of antibiotic resistance in those strains. And there's a chance to actually see how the use of a vaccine in those communities affects that trajectory of antibiotic resistance.
Oh, challenging stuff. Well, thank you so much, Bruce, Penny, and Ted. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you all for being here too. I appreciate it.